Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In early 1990s, Charlotte, North Carolina, a predator stalked the city's east side while hiding in plain sight. Henry Louis Wallace, known as the Taco Bell Strangler, murdered at least 10 young African-American women over a 2-year period, many of whom knew and trusted him as their manager, friend, or acquaintance. What makes this case particularly disturbing isn't just the number of victims, but how Wallace would attend their funerals, comfort their families, and even help search for women he knew were already dead. Despite being questioned multiple times, police failed to connect the murders until it was too late. Today, we'll examine how this charming former Navy man and restaurant manager became one of America's most prolific serial killers, and how systemic failures allowed his killing spree to continue far longer than it should have. Let's dive into the chilling case of the Taco Bell Strangler. In the early 1990s, the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, was experiencing rapid growth. New businesses were opening, the banking industry was booming, and the population was swelling. But beneath this veneer of prosperity, a predator was stalking the city's east side, specifically targeting young African American women. For years, their deaths would go unconnected, the work of a killer hiding in plain sight among them. Henry Louis Wallace was born in Barnwell, South Carolina on November 4, 1965. His early life was marked by hardship and instability. His father was absent, and his mother, Lottie Mae Wallace, worked long hours as a textile mill worker to support Henry and his siblings. Despite the challenges, those who knew Henry as a child described him as charming and well-mannered. He was popular in school, a football star, and even voted best dressed by his high school classmates. After graduating from high school in 1983, Wallace joined the U.S. Navy, where he served for 4 years before receiving an honorable discharge in 1987. During his time in the Navy, Wallace was stationed in Washington State. It was here that the first signs of his violent tendencies began to emerge. In 1987, Wallace was questioned about the rape of a woman in Seattle, though he was never charged. That same year, he was arrested for breaking into a hardware store, a crime for which he would serve only a few months in jail. Upon his release, Wallace moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, where his mother had relocated. Charlotte in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not prepared for what was about to unfold. The city's homicide rate was rising, and the police department was struggling to keep pace with the growing population and increasing crime. It was against this backdrop that Henry Louis Wallace began his killing spree. Wallace's method of operation was consistent and chilling. He would target young African American women whom he knew personally, coworkers, friends of friends, or acquaintances. He would gain entry to their homes, often under the pretense of borrowing money or just to talk. Once inside, he would sexually assault them before strangling them to death. After the murders, he would steal items from their homes, which he would later sell or give as gifts to other women he knew. The first known victim of Wallace's deadly spree was Tashonda Bethea, a 23-year-old woman from his hometown of Barnwell, South Carolina. In March 1990, Bethea went missing. Her body was discovered a month later in a pond. She had been stabbed multiple times. Though Wallace was questioned at the time due to his connection with Bethea, he was not charged, and the case went cold. After moving to Charlotte, Wallace secured a job at Taco Bell on Sharon Amity Road, where he would eventually rise to the position of manager. It was this employment that would later earn him the moniker, the Taco Bell Strangler. His position gave him authority and access to young women who worked under him, several of whom would become his victims. On June 22, 1992, Sharon Nance, a 33-year-old woman known to engage in sex work, was found dead near a cemetery in Charlotte. She had been beaten and strangled. While Wallace would later confess to her murder, At the time, police did not connect her death to any larger pattern. As the months passed, Wallace continued his murderous activities, all while maintaining his facade as a charming, reliable member of the community. Those who worked with him at Taco Bell described him as a good manager, someone who was friendly and supportive. None suspected the darkness that lurked beneath his affable exterior. In May 1992, Caroline Love, a 20-year-old woman who lived with Wallace's girlfriend, disappeared. Love had been a co-worker of Wallace at Taco Bell. When she went missing, Wallace even helped her family search for her and comforted them in their distress. Love's body would not be discovered until Wallace's eventual confession nearly 2 years later, when he led police to her remains in a wooded area in Charlotte. The disappearance of Caroline Love marked the beginning of a series of murders that would span nearly 2 years and claim the lives of at least 10 young women in Charlotte. Despite the growing body count, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department failed to recognize that a serial killer was operating in their city. One of the key factors that allowed Wallace to continue killing for so long was the lack of connection made between the victims. Each murder was investigated as a separate incident, and the similarities in the crimes were not immediately recognized. Additionally, the fact that all of the victims were young African American women from low-income neighborhoods led to accusations that the police were not dedicating sufficient resources to solving these cases. In February 1993, Shauna Hawk, a 20-year-old student at Piedmont Central Community College, was found dead in her bathtub by her mother. She had been strangled. Hawk, like Caroline Love, had worked at Taco Bell under Wallace's management. In a display of breathtaking audacity, Wallace attended Hawk's funeral and even hugged her mother, offering his condolences. Just 3 months later, in May 1993, Audrey Spain, 24, was found strangled in her apartment. Spain was a friend of Wallace's sister. Once again, Wallace inserted himself into the aftermath of the crime, visiting Spain's family and expressing his shock and sadness at her death. The pattern continued in June 1993 with the murder of Valencia Jumper, 21. Jumper was a friend of Wallace's girlfriend and had invited Wallace to her apartment for dinner. After dinner, Wallace strangled her and set her apartment on fire in an attempt to cover up the crime. The fire was discovered and Jumper's body was recovered, but the cause of death was initially attributed to smoke inhalation. It wasn't until Wallace's confession that the true nature of her death was revealed. August 1993 saw the murder of Michelle Stinson, 20, a single mother of 2 young children. Stinson was stabbed and strangled in her apartment while her children were present in another room. One of her sons, just a toddler at the time, was found trying to wake his dead mother when family members arrived at the apartment. By this point, some detectives in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department had begun to suspect that the murders might be connected. However, without concrete evidence linking the crimes, and with each case being handled by different investigators, the connection remained tenuous. The killing spree continued into 1994. In February, Vanessa Little Mack, 25, a single mother of 3, was found strangled in her apartment by her young children. Mack had worked with Wallace at a different Taco Bell location. March 1994 marked a significant escalation in Wallace's killing spree. Within a span of 3 days, he murdered 3 more women: Betty Jean Balcom, 24, Brandy Henderson, 18, and Deborah Ann Slaughter, 35. Betty Jean Balcom was strangled in her apartment on March 9, 1994. Balcom had worked with Wallace at Taco Bell and had previously rebuffed his romantic advances. After killing her, Wallace stole her car and some of her possessions. On March 12, 1994, Wallace went to the apartment of Brandy Henderson, who lived with her boyfriend and their infant son. Henderson's boyfriend was not home at the time. Wallace strangled Henderson and then attempted to kill her 10-month-old son by strangling him as well. Miraculously, the infant survived, though he suffered brain damage from the attack. That same day, Wallace murdered Deborah Ann Slaughter in her apartment. Slaughter was stabbed 38 times in addition to being strangled. The brutality of this murder suggested that Wallace was becoming increasingly violent and less controlled in his actions. It was the rapid succession of these 3 murders in March 1994 that finally led the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department to acknowledge publicly that they were dealing with a serial killer. The community, particularly the African American community on Charlotte's east side, was gripped by fear. Women were warned not to stay alone and to be cautious about who they allowed into their homes. The break in the case came shortly after the March murders. A woman reported that her purse had been stolen and her credit cards were being used fraudulently. The police investigation led them to Henry Louis Wallace, who had used one of the stolen credit cards to purchase shoes. When questioned about the credit card theft, Wallace confessed not only to that crime, but also to the murders. Over the course of a 12-hour interrogation, Wallace provided detailed confessions to the murders of 10 women in Charlotte and 1 in South Carolina. He led police to the remains of Caroline Love, who had been missing since 1992, and provided details about the other murders that only the killer would know. Wallace's arrest on March 13, 1994, brought an end to his killing spree, but the impact of his crimes on the Charlotte community, particularly the families of his victims, would be long-lasting. The case also raised serious questions about the police department's handling of the investigations and whether racial and socioeconomic factors had influenced the level of attention given to the murders. The subsequent investigation revealed that Wallace had been questioned in connection with several of the murders before his arrest, but had been released each time. He had even been questioned about Caroline Love's disappearance and had taken a polygraph test, which he passed. These missed opportunities to apprehend Wallace earlier led to significant criticism of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department. During his trial, which began in September 1996, Wallace's defense team argued that he suffered from mental illness and addiction issues that impaired his judgment. They presented evidence of his crack cocaine use and claimed that he experienced blackouts during which the murders occurred. However, the prosecution countered with evidence of Wallace's calculated behavior, including his efforts to establish alibis and cover his tracks after each murder. The jury was unconvinced by the defense's arguments. On January 7, 1997, Henry Louis Wallace was found guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death for each count. The case of Tashonda Bethia in South Carolina was not included in this trial, but was handled separately. Wallace's case is particularly disturbing, not only because of the number of victims, but also because of the personal connections he had with each of them. Unlike many serial killers who target strangers, Wallace preyed on women who knew and trusted him. This betrayal of trust added an additional layer of horror to his crimes and devastation to the community. The case of Henry Louis Wallace, the Taco Bell Strangler, serves as a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities that exist within communities and the importance of recognizing patterns in violent crimes. It also highlights the devastating impact of implicit biases in law enforcement and the media, which can lead to certain victims receiving less attention and resources than others. For the families of Wallace's victims, the pain of their losses continues to this day. Many have spoken out about their experiences, not only to honor the memories of their loved ones, but also to advocate for changes in how such cases are handled. They hope that by sharing their stories, they can prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Henry Louis Wallace remains on death row in North Carolina, where he continues to appeal his convictions. The state has not executed anyone since 2006, due to various legal challenges to its lethal injection protocol, so it is uncertain when or if Wallace's death sentence will be carried out. The legacy of the Taco Bell Strangler case in Charlotte is complex. It led to changes in how the police department handles potential serial murder cases, including better communication between detectives and more attention to patterns that might indicate a serial offender. However, it also left deep scars on the community, particularly among the families of the victims who continue to question whether their loved ones' deaths could have been prevented if the pattern had been recognized earlier. The story of Henry Louis Wallace is not just about the crimes of one man, but about systemic issues that allowed those crimes to continue for far too long. It's about the lives of the women he killed, each with her own story, dreams, and loved ones. And it's about a community's reckoning with the knowledge that a predator had been living and working among them, hiding behind a mask of normalcy while committing unthinkable acts. As we reflect on this case, it's important to remember the victims not just as statistics or as entries in the grim catalogue of a serial killer's crimes, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. Their names were Tashonda Bethea, Sharon Nance, Caroline Love, Shauna Hawke, Audrey Spain, Valencia Jumper, Michelle Stinson, Vanessa Little Mack, Betty Jean Borkham, Brandy Henderson, and Deborah Ann Slaughter. Each of them mattered, and each of their stories deserves to be told. The investigation into Wallace's crimes also revealed troubling details about his past that might have served as warning signs. During his time in the Navy, Wallace had been disciplined multiple times for various infractions. After his discharge, his criminal behavior escalated from theft to more violent offenses. Yet, despite these red flags, he was able to maintain employment in positions that gave him access to vulnerable women. In the aftermath of Wallace's arrest, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department faced intense scrutiny. Community activists, family members of the victims, and local media all questioned how one man could murder at least 10 women over a 2-year period without being caught. The fact that Wallace had been questioned multiple times in connection with some of the murders, but released each time, only intensified these criticisms. Chief Dennis Nowicki, who had taken over the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department in 1994, shortly before Wallace's arrest, acknowledged that mistakes had been made. In a press conference following Wallace's confession, Nowicki stated, "We should have done more to connect these cases earlier. We have to learn from this tragedy to ensure it never happens again." One of the most vocal critics was Judy Williams, who co-founded Mothers of Murdered Offspring after the death of her goddaughter in an unrelated case. Williams became an advocate for the families of Wallace's victims, helping them navigate their grief while pushing for accountability from law enforcement. "These women were not disposable," Williams said in an interview with the Charlotte Observer. "Each one of them was somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, somebody's mother. The system failed them, and we cannot allow that to happen again." The investigation into the police department's handling of the cases revealed several critical failures. First, there was a lack of communication between different detective units. Each murder was investigated separately, with little sharing of information that might have revealed the connections between the victims. Second, the department had no system in place for tracking potential serial killings. Despite the similarities in the murder methods and the fact that many of the victims knew each other or had connections to Wallace, no one put the pieces together until it was too late. Third, some family members of the victims reported feeling dismissed by investigators when they tried to provide information. Kathy Love, Caroline Love's sister, had told police early on that she suspected Wallace might be involved in her sister's disappearance. She later said, "They didn't take me seriously. If they had, maybe the others would still be alive." In response to these failures, the the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department implemented several changes. They established a homicide information management system to better track and connect violent crimes. They also created protocols for identifying potential serial cases and formed a cold case unit to revisit unsolved murders. The media's coverage of the Wallace case also came under scrutiny. Critics pointed out that the murders of young African American women did not receive the same level of attention as crimes against white victims. The Charlotte Observer, the city's major newspaper, acknowledged this disparity in a series of articles examining the case and the response to it. Had these women been from Myers Park or Dilworth, wrote columnist Fanny Flono, referring to affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods in Charlotte, their deaths would have been front-page news from day one, and the police would have moved heaven and earth to find their killer. The Wallace case also highlighted issues within the criminal justice system beyond just the police response. During his trial, it emerged that Wallace had been on parole at the time of several of the murders. He had been convicted of breaking and entering in 1988, but served only a fraction of his sentence before being released. Critics argued that stricter enforcement of parole violations might have prevented some of the later murders. Wallace's trial began on September 5, 1996, more than 2 years after his arrest. The delay was due in part to the complexity of the case and the extensive forensic evidence that needed to be processed. The trial was held in Mecklenburg County, despite defense requests for a change of venue due to the extensive pre-trial publicity. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Peter Gilchrist and Assistant District Attorney Gentry Caudle, presented a methodical case. They called more than 100 witnesses, including forensic experts, police officers, and family members of the victims. They also presented Wallace's videotaped confession, in which he described each murder in chilling detail. In one particularly disturbing segment of the confession, Wallace described how he strangled Shauna Hawke in her bathtub. "I got behind her and I put my hands around her throat and I strangled her," Wallace said on the tape. "She was gasping for air. She was fighting, trying to get away." The defense, led by attorneys Isabel Day and Jim Gronquist, faced an uphill battle given the overwhelming evidence against their client. They chose not to contest that Wallace had committed the murders, but instead focused on trying to save him from the death penalty by arguing that he suffered from mental illness and diminished capacity due to drug use. Defense psychiatrist Dr. Faye Sultan testified that Wallace suffered from dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, as well as post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from childhood abuse. She claimed that Wallace had at least 4 distinct personalities, including one violent persona known as Boney. When he is in the Boney personality, he is capable of extraordinary violence, Sultan testified. In his primary personality, he has no memory of what Boney does. The prosecution countered with their own mental health experts, who testified that Wallace did not meet the clinical criteria for dissociative identity disorder. They argued that his clear recollection of the murders, his efforts to establish alibis, and his attempts to cover up his crimes all indicated that he was fully aware of his actions and their consequences. Particularly damning was evidence that Wallace had used the ATM cards of several victims after killing them, sometimes within hours of the murders. Surveillance footage showed him calmly withdrawing money, showing no signs of dissociation or distress. Throughout the trial, Wallace sat impassively at the defense table, occasionally taking notes but showing little reaction to the testimony. The families of the victims filled the courtroom each day, some wearing buttons with pictures of their loved ones. After 7 weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury on October 24, 1996. It took them just over 3 days to reach a verdict. On January 7, 1997, Wallace was found guilty of 9 counts of first-degree murder. The jury then had to decide whether to recommend the death penalty or life in prison without parole. During the penalty phase of the trial, the defense presented mitigating factors, including Wallace's troubled childhood, his military service, and testimony from family members who described him as a loving son and brother. Wallace's mother, Lottie Mae Wallace, testified through tears, "I don't know what happened to my son, but this is not the boy I raised. I ask for mercy for him." The prosecution focused on the heinous nature of the crimes, the number of victims, and the premeditation involved. They also emphasized the impact on the victims' families, particularly the children left behind. 5 of Wallace's victims were mothers, leaving a total of 8 children without their mothers. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury recommended the death penalty for each of the 9 murders. On January 29, 1997, Judge Robert Johnston formally sentenced Wallace to death. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Wallace spoke publicly for the first time during the trial. "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused," he said, his voice barely audible in the courtroom. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't understand myself why this happened." The families of the victims had mixed reactions to the verdict and sentence. Some expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, while others felt that no punishment could ever compensate for their loss. "The death penalty doesn't bring my daughter back," said Dee Sumter, Shauna Hawk's mother, after the sentencing. "But it does send a message that our daughters' lives mattered, that they weren't just throwaway people." Following his conviction, Wallace was transferred to Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he joined the other inmates on the state's death row. His case entered the long appeals process that is typical for capital cases in the United States. Wallace's first appeal to the North Carolina Supreme Court was rejected in 2000. The court upheld all 9 of his murder convictions and death sentences, finding no errors in the trial that would warrant overturning the verdict. Subsequent appeals at the state and federal levels have also been unsuccessful. In 2005, Wallace gave a jailhouse interview to a Charlotte television station in which he claimed that he had been framed for some of the murders. He admitted to killing Caroline Love, Shauna Hawk, and Valencia Jumper, but claimed that he was innocent of the other murders. This contradicted his earlier confession, in which he had provided detailed accounts of all the killings. Legal experts dismissed Wallace's new claims as a desperate attempt to avoid execution. The evidence against him, including DNA, fingerprints, and his own initial confession, was overwhelming. As of 2023, Henry Louis Wallace remains on death row in North Carolina. The state has not executed anyone since 2006 due to various legal challenges to its lethal injection protocol and issues with the administration of the death penalty. It's unclear when or if Wallace's sentence will ever be carried out. The impact of Wallace's crimes continues to reverberate through Charlotte. The east side of the city, where most of the murders took place, has undergone significant changes since the mid-1990s. Many of the apartment complexes where the victims lived have been demolished or renovated as part of urban renewal projects. The Taco Bell where Wallace worked and met several of his victims is now a different restaurant. For the families of the victims, however, time has not diminished their loss. Many have found ways to honor their loved ones and channel their grief into positive action. Dee Sumter, Shauna Hawk's mother, became a vocal advocate for victims' rights after her daughter's murder. She co-founded Mothers of Murdered Offspring, an organization that provides support to families who have lost loved ones to homicide and works to prevent violence in the community. "I couldn't save my daughter," Sumter said in a 2014 interview marking the 20th anniversary of Shauna's death. "But maybe through this work, we can save someone else's child." The organization holds candlelight vigils for homicide victims in Charlotte, ensuring that they are not forgotten and that their deaths are not in vain. They also provide counseling services and practical assistance to grieving families. Other family members have established scholarships or memorial funds in honor of their loved ones. The Shauna D. Hawk Scholarship, for example, provides financial assistance to students pursuing careers in social work or counseling. The children of Wallace's victims have grown up in the shadow of his crimes. Some were too young to remember their mothers. Others have vivid memories of discovering their mothers' bodies. Many were raised by grandparents or other relatives, their lives forever altered by Wallace's actions. One of the most poignant stories is that of Brandy Henderson's son, who was just 10 months old when Wallace strangled him after killing his mother. Though he survived, he suffered brain damage from the attack. Now an adult, he has struggled with health issues and developmental delays resulting from the assault. The case of Henry Louis Wallace also had a lasting impact on law enforcement practices, not just in Charlotte but across the country. It became a case study in how not to handle potential serial murder investigations and led to changes in how police departments track and connect violent crimes. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department now has systems in place to flag similarities between homicide cases and to ensure better communication between detective units. They also implemented training programs focused on recognizing the patterns and behaviors associated with serial offenders. The case also highlighted the phenomenon known as missing white woman syndrome, a term used to describe the disproportionate media coverage given to missing or murdered white women compared to women of color. In the years since Wallace's crimes, there has been greater awareness of this disparity, though critics argue that it still exists. Criminologists and researchers have studied Wallace's case extensively, trying to understand what drove him to kill and how he was able to evade detection for so long. Unlike many serial killers who target strangers, Wallace's choice to murder women he knew personally is relatively unusual and made him harder to catch using traditional profiling methods. Dr. Ann Burgess, a leading forensic nurse who has studied numerous serial killers, noted that Wallace's case is distinctive in several ways. Most serial killers choose victims who are strangers to them, which makes their crimes harder to solve, but also provides them with a degree of psychological distance, Burgess explained in a 2010 paper on the case. Wallace's choice to kill women he knew suggests a different psychology at work, possibly a deep-seated rage against women with whom he had formed relationships. The fact that Wallace was African American also made his case unusual in the annals of serial murder, a crime more commonly associated with white perpetrators in the public consciousness. Some researchers have suggested that this racial stereotype may have contributed to the failure to identify the pattern of killings earlier, as investigators may not have been looking for an African American serial killer. Wallace's own explanation for his crimes has varied over the years. In his initial confession, he claimed that he didn't know why he killed the women, saying, "It's like something took over me." Later, he blamed his crack cocaine addiction, claiming that he only committed the murders while high. However, the evidence suggests a more calculated pattern of behavior. Wallace specifically targeted vulnerable women whom he knew would be alone. He gained entry to their homes through trust rather than force. He stole from his victims not just randomly, but selectively, taking items he could use or sell. All of these factors point to a level of planning and awareness inconsistent with his claims of dissociation or drug-induced psychosis. Some of the most chilling aspects of the case involve Wallace's behavior after the murders. He would often attend the funerals of his victims, comforting their families, and even participating in searches for women he knew were already dead. This ability to compartmentalize and maintain a normal facade is characteristic of psychopathic behavior. Dr. Michael Wellner, a forensic psychiatrist who reviewed the case, noted, the capacity to kill someone you know, to look into the eyes of someone familiar to you as you take their life, and then to carry on as if nothing happened. That reflects a profound emotional detachment that goes beyond what we typically see even in serial murder cases. The Charlotte community's healing process has been long and complex. For years after Wallace's arrest, women in the city reported being more cautious about who they allowed into their homes. The case shattered the sense of security many had felt, particularly in tight-knit neighborhoods where people generally knew and trusted their neighbors. Community forums and healing services were held in the months following Wallace's arrest, providing spaces for residents to express their fear, anger, and grief. Religious leaders played a significant role in these efforts, offering spiritual comfort and calling for unity across racial and socioeconomic lines. The media coverage of the case evolved over time as well. Initial reports often focused on the sensational aspects of the crimes and Wallace's background. Later coverage, particularly around the anniversaries of the murders or developments in Wallace's appeals, has tended to center more on the victims and their families, giving voice to those most affected by the tragedy. Documentaries and books about the case have sought to analyze what went wrong in the investigation and to memorialize the victims. The 2019 documentary Bad Henry, which aired on the Investigation Discovery Channel, featured interviews with detectives who worked the case and family members of the victims. It presented a comprehensive timeline of the murders and the investigation, highlighting both the investigative failures and the eventual breakthrough that led to Wallace's arrest. The case has also been featured in episodes of true crime series such as Serial Killers, The Real-Life Hannibal Lecters, and Most Evil, often focusing on Wallace's ability to maintain a normal, even charming persona while committing his crimes. For the current generation of Charlotte residents, many of whom were not yet born or were very young when the murders occurred, the case of the Taco Bell Strangler has become part of the city's dark history. It's a cautionary tale about the danger that can lurk behind a friendly face, and a reminder of the importance of community vigilance and effective law enforcement. The physical locations associated with the murders have changed over the years. Many of the apartment complexes where the victims lived have been renovated or demolished. The neighborhoods on Charlotte's east side have undergone significant demographic and economic changes as the city has continued to grow and develop. Yet for those who lived through that time, certain places will always be associated with Wallace's crimes. The Taco Bell on Sharon Amity Road, though now a different business, still evokes memories for longtime residents who remember when it was the workplace of both Wallace and several of his victims. As Charlotte continues to evolve, the case of Henry Louis Wallace serves as a somber reminder of a dark chapter in the city's history. It's a story of lives cut short, of a community's vulnerability, and of a justice system that failed to protect some of its most vulnerable members until it was too late for many. It's also a story of resilience, of families who have carried on despite unimaginable loss, of a community that came together in the face of fear, and of reforms that emerged from tragedy. The legacy of Wallace's crimes is not just one of horror, but also of the changes they prompted in how society responds to violence against women, particularly women of color. For the families of Tashonda Bethia, Sharon Nance, Caroline Love, Shauna Hawke, Audrey Spain, Valencia Jumper, Michelle Stinson, Vanessa Little Mack, Betty Jean Borkham, Brandy Henderson, and Deborah Ann Slaughter, no amount of analysis or reform can fill the void left by their loved ones. Their grief continues, tempered perhaps by time but never truly diminished. As one family member put it during a memorial service marking the 25th anniversary of the murders, "We don't want them to be remembered just as victims of Henry Wallace. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, friends. They had dreams and plans. They were loved. That's what we want people to remember." In the end, The story of the Taco Bell Strangler is not just about Henry Louis Wallace and his crimes. It's about the women whose lives he took, the families he devastated, and a community forever changed by his actions. It's a reminder of the human cost of violence and the importance of remembering the victims not just as statistics, but as individuals whose lives mattered and continue to matter in the memories of those who loved them.